Hey, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. I'm so glad you're here tonight. If you're brand new here, welcome to Sleepy Old World. This channel is exactly what it sounds like. Long, slow, careful journeys into the past, told the way history deserves to be told. Quietly, in detail, with all the human texture left in. No explosions, no dramatic music stings, no lists rattling past at speed. Just a voice, a story, and the kind of deep history that most people never get to hear because it is buried inside the small lives of ordinary people. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe. It means more than I can properly explain. And if tonight's video settles something in your chest the way the last one did for so many of you, leave a like. Now, turn the lights down if you haven't already. Get yourself under whatever you sleep under, a blanket, a quilt, something heavy, something soft. Find the position your body wants, and let everything else wait. Because tonight, we're going somewhere that has always fascinated me. Not to a battlefield, not to a palace, not to one of those grand, sweeping moments that fills history textbooks with dates and portraits and the names of men who signed papers. We're going somewhere more intimate than all of that. We're going to a Victorian woman's dressing table. We are going to stand beside her mirror, open her drawers, read the labels on her little glass bottles, and try to understand what was really going on underneath the silk and the whalebone and the perfectly arranged hair. We're going to look at the beauty rules of the Victorian era, not the polished version that appears in museum descriptions, but the real ones, the unspoken ones, the ones that were never written down anywhere because everyone simply knew them. The ones that shaped every hour of a woman's day from the moment she woke until the moment she finally peeled it all away in the privacy of her own bedroom at night. And I promise you, by the time we are done, you will never look at a photograph of a Victorian woman the same way again. You will see what the photograph was always hiding. Picture a woman in London in the year 1878. She is standing in her bedroom in the early morning, and the window behind her shows a sky that has not quite decided between grey and pale yellow. The gas lamp on the wall has been lit by the housemaid 20 minutes ago. There is a fire in the small grate, and it has only just begun to put warmth into the room. She's in her nightgown, which reaches all the way to the floor, and her hair hangs loose around her shoulders, and for approximately the next 2 hours she will undergo a process so involved, so layered, so ritually precise, that the version of herself she presents to the world at breakfast will bear only a passing resemblance to the woman who stood barefoot at the window, watching the sky turn yellow. She does not experience any of this as unusual. She does not experience it as oppressive, at least not in those exact words, because she has never known anything else. This is simply what it is to get dressed. This is simply what it is to be a woman of her class and her time. The dressing table is her workstation. The corset is her armour, the powder and the pins and the tiny glass bottles of rose water and glycerin are her tools. And the rules, the invisible, unwritten, absolute rules that govern every single choice she makes from the shade of her ribbon to the angle of her hat, those rules are the water she swims in. She cannot see them because she has never been outside them. Let us start at the very beginning. Let us start before the corset and before the powder and before the elaborate hair. Let us start with something so fundamental to Victorian beauty culture that it defined almost everything else that came after it. Let us start with the skin. In the Victorian imagination, the ideal complexion was something very specific. It was pale, not simply fair in the way that word gets used now, meaning light-toned, but pale in the most deliberate sense. White as paper, white as good porcelain, white as the expensive lace that trimmed a fine collar. The fashionable Victorian complexion suggested fragility, refinement, and above all else it suggested that you had never, not once, stood in full sun for any meaningful length of time, because only one kind of woman had sun on her face. The woman who worked outside, the milkmaid, the farm labourer, the washerwoman carrying her load to the river, the woman selling things at a market stall. These were the women whose faces showed the weather, whose noses and foreheads turned pink or brown from hours of outdoor exposure. And the entire invisible grammar of Victorian class society was structured to make sure that nobody confused you with her. Pale skin was not about being beautiful in some abstract sense. Pale skin was about being read correctly by everyone you encountered. It communicated status, leisure, the kind of life lived indoors, waited upon, protected from physical labour and its visible consequences. A woman with a summer colour in her cheeks had to work to explain it away, to make it clear it was an accident rather than a condition, that she was the kind of person who rode in carriages rather than walked along the high street. So the first great project of Victorian women's beauty culture was the protection and cultivation of white skin. The rules around sun exposure were strenuous to a degree that seems almost comic now. When a Victorian woman went outside during daylight hours, she went armoured against the light. She had a bonnet or a hat with a brim wide enough to cast her face into shadow. She had the gloves that covered her wrists and the backs of her hands. She had a parasol, and this was not an accessory in the decorative sense, not the way we think of accessories now as optional enhancements. A parasol was equipment. It was functional. It was carried as deliberately as an umbrella is carried in rain. The parasol itself had its own set of rules. During afternoon visiting hours, it was a slightly smaller, more elegant model, often covered in silk or fine cotton, sometimes trimmed with lace or ribbon at the edge. During a morning walk, a sturdier version was acceptable. Carrying the parasol at exactly the right angle was part of its use. Not held flat over the head, which looked clumsy but tilted slightly toward the sun, the canopy angled to intercept the light while the holder moved through the street with what was supposed to look like effortless grace. On horseback, a woman used a riding veil instead. Driving in an open carriage, a thicker veil was attached to the bonnet and brought down over the face. Even seated at a window in her own home, if the window caught the afternoon sun, a woman of careful habits kept her chair pulled back from the direct light. We are talking about an enormous amount of daily effort devoted entirely to the project of not getting light on your face. And this was only the defensive side of it. The offensive side, the creams and preparations and treatments applied to the skin itself to keep it white and soft and unmarked by the evidence of living, that was its own entire world. Every Victorian woman who could afford it had a skincare routine, not in the modern sense of 3 or 5 products applied in a particular order, but in the older, more elaborate sense of a daily ritual that involved multiple stages and a collection of preparations, many of them made at home, some of them purchased from pharmacies or from the catalogues of companies that had been selling beauty products since the 1860s. The most fundamental of these was cold cream. Cold cream, in one form or another, has existed for almost 2,000 years. The Roman physician Galen is often credited with something like an early version of it, a preparation of beeswax, water and olive oil that cooled the skin as it was applied, which is where the name came from. By the Victorian era, cold cream had evolved into a preparation of beeswax, almond oil, rose water, and occasionally a little borax to help the mixture emulsify properly. It came in small, flat ceramic pots with lids, and it sat on virtually every woman's dressing table regardless of class, because it was cheap enough to make at home if you could not afford to buy it ready-made. The use of it was specific. You applied cold cream to your face after washing, working it gently into the skin with your fingertips, and then you wiped it away with a soft cloth, pulling away with it the day's accumulated dust and coal smoke, and the faint residue of anything else you had applied that morning. In a city like Victorian London, where the air was genuinely thick with coal soot and industrial particles, this was not a small thing. The cloth that came away from your face at the end of the day was grey. The cold cream was doing real work. Then you applied a second, thinner layer and left it on overnight. This is the part that modern people always find slightly strange, sleeping in your face cream. But Victorian women understood instinctively what modern cosmetic science has confirmed, which is that skin repairs itself more effectively during sleep, that moisture applied at night is absorbed more deeply than moisture applied during the day, and that the nighttime layer of cold cream was simply the skin receiving what it needed to stay soft and clear. Victorian beauty manuals were quite specific about all of this. There were dozens of them published throughout the era, from the gently titled Ladies' Treasury Guides to more frankly commercial productions with names like The Boudoir Companion and Beauty and How to Keep It. They described the correct method of applying cold cream, the correct direction of strokes, the importance of being gentle around the delicate skin near the eyes, the necessity of warming the cream slightly between the fingertips before pressing it to the face. They were also, many of them, profoundly detailed about what cold cream was supposed to prevent, because the great enemy of the Victorian complexion was not primarily wrinkles, though those were of concern. It was something called coarseness, coarse skin, coarse pores, the idea that the texture of the skin could betray something about the texture of the life lived, that a woman who did not tend to her skin carefully enough would begin to look rough, worked, lived in, and therefore like the wrong kind of woman. The logic was circular in the particular way that beauty standards always are. Soft, fine-pored skin was considered a natural characteristic of gentlewomen, but it also required constant, effortful maintenance to preserve. So the effort of preservation was itself part of demonstrating that you were the kind of woman who had the time and the resources to make the effort. The beauty was simultaneously natural and manufactured, and the manufacture had to be invisible. Beyond cold cream, the Victorian skincare arsenal included rosewater, which was used as a toner, applied to the face on a soft cloth to remove the last traces of cream and close the pores, glycerin, which was a relatively new ingredient in the 1870s and 1880s, and was valued for its humectant qualities, its ability to draw moisture from the air and hold it against the skin. Cucumber water, which was made by pressing fresh cucumbers and straining the juice, and which was believed to cool and soothe the skin and reduce any redness after exposure to the elements. Elderflower water, which had been a traditional skin preparation in England for centuries and was believed to whiten and soften the complexion when used consistently. Some women made their own preparations from recipes passed down from mothers or found in the household management books that sat on the shelves alongside cookery manuals and guides to domestic medicine. Others bought ready-made products from the growing number of companies that were beginning to manufacture them commercially. Rowland's Calidor was one of the most popular, a liquid preparation for the skin that promised to remove freckles, roughness, tan, and all other impurities of the complexion. Rowland's Macassar oil was for the hair. Between these two products alone, Rowland's had cornered an enormous portion of the Victorian beauty market. But here is the thing that sits uncomfortably underneath all of this. The thing that the beautiful names and the ceramic pots and the delicate language of the beauty manuals were papering over. Some of the preparations Victorian women used on their skin were genuinely dangerous, not in the way that everything is now accused of being dangerous, but in the way that actually contained substances that caused real harm and that women used anyway because the pressure to conform to the standard was stronger than the evidence of the risk. Bismuth was one. White lead was another. These were the two most effective skin whiteners available in the Victorian era, and they were used widely enough that their consequences showed up in medical literature with depressing regularity. Bismuth preparations were perhaps slightly less catastrophic than lead-based ones, but they had their own problem. Bismuth turned grey-black when it came into contact with hydrogen sulfide, which is present in coal gas and in some foods. A woman who had applied bismuth powder to her face and then walked into a room lit by gas lamps might find her carefully whitened complexion turning darkly mottled within a few minutes. There are accounts of this happening at evening parties, of women excusing themselves in apparent distress to find a mirror and discover that their faces had gone patchy and strange. Some beauty manuals address this directly, advising women to test their powder preparations near a flame before trusting them to a public appearance. Lead was worse in almost every way except the cosmetic one. White lead, lead carbonate, gave a perfectly smooth, perfectly opaque coverage. It filled pores invisibly. It imparted an extraordinary whiteness to the skin. It was also, as anyone who paid attention to the medical journalism of the period would have known, a cumulative poison that attacked the nervous system, damaged the kidneys, and eventually produced symptoms ranging from headaches and trembling to complete physical collapse. The women who used it regularly often did not connect their declining health to the powder they put on their faces every morning. Lead poisoning is insidious in exactly that way. It builds slowly, and its symptoms mimic other conditions, and by the time it is obvious something is wrong, the damage has already been done. Victorian physicians wrote about it. The Lancet published pieces about it. Individual medical men condemned it publicly and repeatedly, and women kept using it because the alternative, appearing in public with skin that was anything other than white and smooth and perfect, felt in many cases genuinely impossible. That is not weakness. I want to be careful about that. That is the mathematics of a social system that had made the stakes of appearance so high that rational people made irrational choices about their own bodies in order to meet them. We are not so far from this as we would like to believe. Now, let us talk about freckles. This might seem like a small thing, a minor detail, almost comic in its specificity, but the Victorian attitude toward freckles is one of the clearest windows into how the beauty standards of the era actually worked in the lives of ordinary women, because freckles were incredibly common and the effort devoted to removing or concealing them was enormous. Freckles were considered a defect, not a charming quirk, not an interesting feature, not a matter of personal taste. A defect. They were the mark of sun exposure, of careless movement through the world, of failure to protect oneself adequately from the light. On a very young child they might be tolerable, on an adult woman they were evidence of something wrong. The beauty manuals were full of freckle remedies, lemon juice applied directly to the skin, morning and evening, for weeks at a time, buttermilk, a preparation made from green pineapple, a mixture of vinegar and horseradish left to steep, and then strained and applied as a wash, a paste of oatmeal and cream, elderflower water, again, raw potatoes sliced and pressed against the skin, juice of bitter almonds, which worked because bitter almonds contain small amounts of hydrocyanic acid, effective for bleaching, and also in larger quantities potentially lethal. None of these worked in the sense of actually removing freckles permanently. Most of them provided a very modest and temporary lightening effect at best, and at worst they irritated the skin badly enough that the woman was left with redness and peeling on top of the freckles, which was obviously worse. The industry around freckle removal was sustained less by its results than by the strength of the desire, the depth of the need, and this is the pattern that repeats itself throughout Victorian beauty culture, through almost every one of its rituals and preparations and rules. The desire was real, the social pressure was real, the consequences of failing to conform were real, and the solutions available were at best partial and at worst harmful, and women pursued them anyway because there was no other option that looked like an option. Alongside the skin, the hair. Victorian women's hair was its own great project, its own lifelong enterprise, and the rules around it were, if anything, even more elaborate than the rules around the complexion, because hair was simultaneously more visible and more symbolically loaded than any other aspect of a woman's appearance. In the 1860s and into the 1870s, the fashionable silhouette required an enormous amount of hair arranged in an elaborate structure at the back and sides of the head, with a smooth center parting and the hair drawn back from the face. As the decades progressed, the specifics shifted. The chignon moved higher, then lower. The front hair was crimped or waved. The overall mass was redistributed, but the fundamental project remained the same. More hair, arranged more precisely, maintained more consistently, more than any individual woman's natural growth could realistically provide. This is where the Victorian trade in false hair becomes important. It was enormous. It was not fringe or experimental. It was a mainstream, widely accepted industry that sold hairpieces, pads, rats, switches, and full wigs to women across every economic level from middle class upward, and it did so with no particular stigma attached. A rat, in this context, is not an animal. It is a pad of false hair, or sometimes of stuffing, wool, horsehair, cotton wool, that was pinned beneath the woman's own hair to add volume and give the elaborate arrangements their characteristic fullness. These pads came in various sizes and could be bought at drapers, at hairdressers, at the rapidly multiplying department stores of the era. They were sold matter-of-factly alongside hairpins and pomades and combs. A switch was a longer piece of false hair, a length of woven or plaited hair that could be wound into a chignon or attached to add to the length of a braid. The hair for these pieces came from all over the world, from rural women in France and Italy and Germany, who sold their hair when economic necessity required it, from the harvest of hair collected at convents, and from other institutional settings, occasionally from more troubling sources that the trade manuals of the period were discreet about. The quality varied. The best switches were made from European hair that closely matched the purchaser's own colour and texture. The cheapest were made from Asian hair, which had a different texture that made blending difficult. The hairpiece industry was so thoroughly normalised that when Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women in 1868 and gave Jo March the memorable scene of cutting off her hair to sell, the sale itself was not remarkable to her Victorian readership. Everyone understood the market. Everyone understood the value. A Victorian woman's daily hair routine was built around the preservation of an elaborate structure that might take 40 minutes to an hour to create, and that had to survive an entire day of activity, of visiting and receiving visitors, of carriage rides with the window down, of hours in rooms where the coal fire dried the air and made fine hair frizz, of evenings where the gas lamps added heat to enclosed spaces and pins became gradually less secure. Hairpins were everywhere. Thousands of hairpins were manufactured and sold and lost and found under cushions and in the corners of rooms and on the floors of carriages throughout the Victorian era. The average elaborate hairstyle required dozens of them, placed with precision to hold each element in relationship to every other element. A woman who dressed her own hair had to learn this placement through experience and repetition, through her fingers' accumulated knowledge of where the pin needed to go and at what angle. Most women of the middle and upper classes had their hair dressed by a lady's maid or by a hairdresser for important occasions, but the daily arrangement was often a solitary early morning practice, a woman alone at her dressing table in the lamplight, her arms raised, her fingers working through the back of her own hair that she could only see reflected and reversed in the glass. The preparation applied to the hair itself before arrangement was important. Pomade, thick, waxy preparations based on lard or suet, or sometimes bear grease, scented with various oils to make them more pleasant, were used to smooth the hair and hold it in position. Macassar oil, which we mentioned as a Rowland's product, was one of the most popular, and it was so ubiquitous and so prone to leaving greasy marks on upholstered chair backs and the fabric of sofas that the anti-macassar, those small fabric covers placed over the backs and arms of chairs, was invented specifically to protect furniture from it. The word anti-macassar is literally named for the thing it was protecting furniture from. The hair was not washed frequently by modern standards. Monthly was common, and some women washed less often than that. This was partly a practical constraint. Washing Victorian hair was a significant undertaking involving large quantities of hot water, a process for applying the water with care so as not to disarrange the hair more than necessary, a drying process that could take hours, and then the full process of redressing. It was also less happily, partly a result of the fact that the available washing preparations, soap-based, highly alkaline, stripped the hair of its natural oils so effectively that regular washing left hair dry and brittle and difficult to manage. So women managed with dry cleaning instead, working preparations through the hair with a fine-toothed comb to absorb oil, and with the regular brushing that was one of the most consistent rituals of the Victorian woman's morning and evening. 100 brush strokes. You have probably heard this number. It has the quality of a folk wisdom, one of those pieces of advice passed down from mother to daughter across generations, and it was absolutely real as Victorian practice. The purpose of the 100 strokes was not the specific number, but what the repetition achieved, the distribution of the natural oil from the scalp through the length of the hair shaft, which reduced the need for applied preparations and kept the hair shining without the flatness of over-conditioned modern hair. A boar bristle brush, with its slightly rough natural keratin bristles, was the correct tool. It gripped the hair shaft just enough to pull the oil downward, and it was gentle enough not to break the hair. This is one of those places where Victorian beauty practice turns out to have been right in a way that the era's practitioners could not have explained scientifically. Modern trichologists, hair scientists, will tell you that regular brushing with a natural bristle brush, starting at the scalp and moving downward, is genuinely beneficial for hair health. The Victorians did not know why. They knew it worked. The brushing happened in the morning before dressing the hair, and again in the evening before retiring, and the evening brushing was usually the more leisurely, more meditative of the two. A woman at her dressing table with the day's structure coming down around her shoulders, the pins removed one by one and placed in the small dish provided for them. The hair brushed out in long strokes that were as close to relaxation as many Victorian women ever permitted themselves. We will come back to the evening, but first the corset, because we cannot talk honestly about Victorian beauty without talking about the corset, and we cannot talk honestly about the corset without talking about what it actually was and what it actually did, which is considerably more complicated than the version most people have encountered. The corset, in the Middle Victorian period, roughly 1860 through 1890, was a garment that covered the torso from just below the bust to the hips. It was made from layers of tightly woven cotton or coutil, a heavy herringbone weave fabric specifically manufactured for the purpose, stiffened with a grid of bones inserted into channels sewn into the body of the garment. The name bone is preserved from earlier centuries when actual whalebone was used, but by the mid-Victorian period, the bones were more often steel, either flat strips of spring steel that gave a smooth, even pressure, or what were called spiral steels, coiled springs that allowed a small degree of flex for movement. Boning was also made from cane and from a hard plant material called coralline, which was a variety of dried seaweed. The corset laced at the back, through a long row of eyelets reinforced with metal grommets, with a busk, a rigid metal closure, at the front that fastened with a series of studs and slots and could be opened and closed without disturbing the lacing. The busk was a relatively recent innovation when it appeared in the 1850s. Before it, corsets had to be unlaced entirely to be put on and removed, which made getting dressed an even more laborious process than it already was. What the corset did to the body was redistribute pressure. It did not magically make the waist smaller in any permanent sense. The organs and the flesh simply arranged themselves differently while the garment was worn, returning to their natural configuration when it was removed. What it did was create, for the duration of wearing, the fashionable silhouette, a longer compressed waist, a smoother line from chest to hip, a slightly raised and separated bust line. It also provided something that genuinely mattered for the women of the era, which was back support. The garment essentially functioned as an external skeleton for the upper body, and women who wore corsets daily for years often reported genuine physical discomfort when they went without one, not because of any damage, but because their own postural muscles had learnt to do less work while the corset was doing so much of it. None of this quite lines up with the version of the corset that lives in popular imagination, which is essentially a torture device applied by villainous social pressure to innocent women who could barely breathe while wearing it. That version is not entirely wrong. It captures something real about the extremes, but it misses the much more ordinary, much more ambiguous, much more human reality of the garment as it was actually worn by most women most of the time. Most Victorian women did not tight lace. Most Victorian women wore their corsets at a level of lacing that was snug and supportive, but not severely restrictive. The fashionable waist measurement, advertised in dress patterns and discussed in fashion journalism, the famous 18-inch waist that appears in our cultural memory of the Victorian era, was an aspirational measurement, not an average one. Contemporary accounts of corseted waist sizes from the period, including measurements taken by dressmakers and from surviving garments in museum collections, suggest that the average fashionable Victorian waist sat somewhere between 22 and 26 inches, still smaller than is typical today for a woman of equivalent height and build, because the standard itself was smaller, but not the tortured extreme of mythology. Tight lacing, the practice of progressively reducing the waist measurement through sustained extreme lacing, was real, and it was controversial within the Victorian era itself, not just in retrospect. Medical opinion against it was consistent and sustained. Fashion journalism discussed it anxiously. It appeared regularly in the correspondence columns of women's magazines, with readers writing in to describe their own practices and physicians writing in to warn against them. The women who genuinely tight-laced to extreme degrees were a small and self-consciously transgressive subset of a much larger culture of ordinary corseted women, and the confusion of the extreme with the norm has distorted how we understand the garment entirely. What is true, and worth sitting with, is that even ordinary corseting had consequences that accumulated over years. The constant pressure of the garment trained the posture in ways that became difficult to undo. The rib cage, in women who corseted from adolescence, showed visible adaptations in the shape and positioning of the lower ribs. The muscles of the abdomen, relieved of their work by the external structure, weakened over time. Doctors who wrote about these consequences were not wrong, even if they sometimes overstated them. And there is something else that matters about the corset beyond its physical effects. There is the psychological reality of it as daily experience, the sensation of putting it on each morning, of lacing it to the day's level of tightness, of feeling the body reshape itself around the garment's demands, of moving through the day aware, always at some level aware, of its presence. Victorian women wrote about this sensation. Some found it supportive and containing in a way that felt almost comfortable once they were accustomed. Some found it oppressive and longed for the moment of release. Most experienced it as simply the texture of being a woman in this particular body in this particular time, which is perhaps the most honest and most complicated thing about it. The The rules around corsetry were specific and unspoken. A lady wore her corset, full stop. You could not be received without it. You could not appear in public without it. The uncorseted woman communicated something about herself that the social world would not receive politely. What she communicated was variously interpreted as laziness, indifference to appearance, loose morals, or illness, because the only acceptable reason to appear without a corset was medical. Young girls began wearing lightly boned stays, a junior version of the garment, from childhood, and transitioned to full corsets at adolescence. This was not considered anything but normal. The corset was part of the female body's necessary equipment. Like the question of sun and pale skin, the rules around it were not experienced as rules because they were simply the shape of reality. Beneath the corset, the undergarments; above it, the dress. The layers between the body and the world were themselves governed by rules that were as absolute and as invisible as everything else. A camise, a loose, usually white garment in cotton or linen, was worn against the skin under the corset. Its purpose was partly hygienic, to protect the corset itself from the body's moisture, and to protect the body from the roughness of the corset's interior. Over the corset came the petticoats, the number and type of which varied by decade as the fashionable silhouette changed beneath them. In the 1860s and early 1870s, a crinoline cage, a lightweight framework of steel hoops, held the enormous full skirts away from the legs. By the late 1870s and through the 1880s, this had been replaced by the bustle, a framework or padding worn at the back of the waist to create the distinctive shelf-like projection at the rear that was, for a decade or so, among the most recognizable silhouettes in the history of fashion. The bustle went in and out during the 1880s in two distinct phases, a soft, draped version in the early part of the decade, then a brief period of flatter fashion, then the return of an even more extreme, more architectural bustle in the mid to late 1880s before it finally disappeared. Women who lived through this period navigated these changes not as aesthetic choices in the modern sense, but as social necessities. Being visibly out of fashion, wearing the wrong silhouette, the wrong sleeve shape, the wrong arrangement of trim, was to invite a particular kind of notice that was not comfortable. And the dress over all of this, the outer garment itself, carried its own rules. Colour was one of the most complex. The Victorian colour vocabulary for clothes was enormously specific, and the choices were not merely aesthetic, they communicated things. A married woman had access to a much wider palette than an unmarried girl, because colour itself was considered a kind of statement about self-presentation that required the sanction of married life to make freely. Young unmarried women were expected to wear lighter, quieter colours: white, cream, pale blue, soft pink, lilac, colours that communicated youth, modesty, the unannouncedness that was thought appropriate to a woman not yet chosen. A widow wore black for a set period that was itself governed by rules: full mourning, half mourning, the gradual reintroduction of colour in prescribed stages. The Queen herself, after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, chose to remain in full mourning for the remaining 40 years of her life, and her conspicuous grief cast a very long shadow over the colour choices of respectable women throughout the era. Colour also communicated time of day. Morning dress was one thing, simpler, less trimmed, more muted. Afternoon dress was more elaborate. Evening dress was something else entirely, and the rules governing what could be shown and how were as precise as any other code in the Victorian lexicon. The neckline, for instance. In the daytime, the neckline of a respectable woman's dress closed high at the throat, usually with a small standing collar or a soft cravat or a folded white linen at the neck. The idea that any portion of the upper chest or décolletage might be visible during the day was out of the question. In the evening, at formal dinners or dances or evening parties, the rules reversed almost completely. Low décolletage was not merely permissible but required, and the woman who appeared at a formal evening event with her neck and upper chest covered looked conspicuously overdressed, conspicuously prudish, conspicuously wrong. The logic was not, as it might appear, simply about what men wanted to see. It was about the careful passing of occasion, about demonstrating that you understood the difference between a morning call and a dinner party, that you could read the social register of an event and dress accordingly. Getting it wrong in either directions, appearing at breakfast in evening dress or at a dinner party in morning dress, signaled a failure of social competence that was taken very seriously. Sleeves changed through the era in ways that would take a small book to properly document. The tight sleeves of the 1860s gave way gradually to the expanded gigot sleeves of the early 1890s, those extraordinary puffed constructions at the shoulder that reduced again to closer-fitting sleeves by the end of the decade. Each transition was tracked and adopted by women who understood that the outline of their arm against the air was a communication. Trimming was a language of its own. Lace, ribbon, braid, buttons, ruffles, jet beading, appliqued velvet. Each of these materials had its appropriate application, its appropriate quantity, and its appropriate occasion. Too little trim on a formal occasion suggested poverty. Too much on a morning dress suggested vulgarity. The balance required both knowledge and practice, and the women who had it moved through the world, producing the particular impression of effortlessness that required the most effort of all to achieve. Because effortlessness was the ideal that sat over all of it. The great performance required of Victorian women, in their dress, in their grooming, in their posture and their movement and their expression, was that none of it looked like performance. The goal was to appear natural, unconcerned, as though the elaborate construction of the acceptable self had simply occurred without effort, as though the pale skin had always been that white, the hair always arranged so precisely, the waist always that particular shape. The rules existed to produce a reality. The rule about the rule was that the rule must not show. Let us talk about the face now, not the skin which we covered at the beginning, but what was done to it, or more precisely and more interestingly, what was officially not done to it, and what was actually done to it, and the elaborate social negotiation between those two things. The official position of the Victorian era on cosmetics, on what we would now call makeup, was that respectable women did not use them. This position was stated explicitly in conduct books and beauty manuals and women's magazines, and it was held sincerely by a significant portion of the women who held it, and it was also quietly, extensively, almost universally ignored. The association of visible cosmetics with immorality was old by the time Victoria came to the throne. It had its roots partly in religious disapproval of vanity, partly in class anxiety about artifice, and partly in the very specific cultural logic by which the women who were known to paint their faces were also, in the Victorian imaginary, the women who were not respectable, actresses, music hall performers, prostitutes, women whose livelihoods depended on being looked at in a way that admitted, required, the commerce of appearance. A lady, by contrast, was supposed to derive her appearance from nature and from character, not from artifice. Her colour was supposed to be the natural colour of health and virtue, not the applied colour of performance. Her lips were supposed to be red because she was young and vigorous, not because she had touched them with anything. Her eyes were supposed to be bright because she was happy and good, not because she had darkened the skin beneath them. This position was absurd in the specific way that all morally loaded beauty standards eventually become absurd, which is that it placed the entire responsibility for looking right onto the body itself, while simultaneously creating conditions that made looking right without assistance extremely difficult. The Victorian woman was expected to be always pale and always with a becoming colour in her cheeks, which are two things that are very difficult to achieve simultaneously by natural means. She was expected to have smooth, even skin tone at all times, in all weather, regardless of stress or illness or the natural vagaries of a living face. She was expected to look polished and groomed and finished in a way that the unassisted human face does not quite manage without help. So of course they used cosmetics, of course they did. They used them with a subtlety and a discretion that was itself a skill, applying them in ways that added to without announcing themselves, that corrected without revealing that correction had been necessary. The goal was not to look made up. The goal was to look as though you had simply naturally managed to look right. The cosmetics industry was booming throughout the Victorian era, producing an enormous range of products at a range of price points. What was interesting was how these products were sold and described, because they were almost never sold simply as what they were. They were sold as treatments, as tonics, as preparations that would restore or preserve or enhance the natural qualities of the complexion. The language of commerce was the language of medicine rather than the language of decoration. Bloom of Youth, which was a very popular face powder from the 1860s onwards, was sold as a complexion preparation, not as a cosmetic. Its name suggested that it was drawing out something already present rather than adding something new. The fact that it contained lead carbonate, white lead, was not prominently advertised, though nor was it exactly secret. The ingredients were sometimes listed, and the poisonous nature of lead was known to anyone who thought about it. The product was enormously popular anyway. Rice powder was the more cautious alternative, finely ground rice that could be pressed lightly over the face to reduce the shine of natural oils and even the skin tone, without the risks associated with lead or bismuth. By the 1880s and 1890s, as public awareness of the dangers of lead cosmetics was growing, rice powder was heavily marketed as the safe, natural, pure alternative. Its popularity grew correspondingly. The application of any powder at all was officially denied. A woman who looked powdered was not considered to be wearing powder. If her skin was smooth and matte in a way that human skin is not naturally smooth and matte, this was attributed to the excellence of her complexion, not to what she had put on it. Lip color was applied with even greater discretion. The preparations available ranged from simple petroleum-based salves with a small amount of carmine colorant to more elaborate pomades, to the habit of gently biting or pinching the lips before any encounter where the appearance mattered. Red wine was sometimes used. A small amount of geranium petal crushed could leave a temporary stain. The point was always the same. Any added color had to be indistinguishable from the natural color of a woman's lips when at their best. Eyes were even more delicate territory, darkening the area around the eyes, emphasizing the lashes, defining the brow. All of these were done, but all of them were done with materials that could be plausibly denied. Burned matches cooled and applied carefully to the lash line. Kohl brought back from Egypt and the Near East by women with colonial connections or cosmopolitan tastes. A slightly darker pomade applied to the brows to define them. The extraordinary care taken in the application was matched by the extraordinary care taken not to let the application be visible. And then there was belladonna. Belladonna, the plant whose name means beautiful woman in Italian, was used in eye drops that dilated the pupil, creating the wide, dark, luminous eye that was considered one of the marks of beauty and vivacity. The drops, made from the extract of the Atropa belladonna plant, worked by blocking the muscular contractions that normally reduce the pupil in bright light, leaving it expanded and dark, and if you did not know what you were looking at, simply extraordinarily striking. The side effects included blurred vision, sometimes severe enough to make reading impossible for hours after application. Prolonged use caused progressive damage to the eyes. Belladonna is toxic. The margin between the cosmetic dose and the dangerous one is not enormous. This was known. The Illustrated London News published pieces about it. Medical journals discussed it. And yet it was used discreetly by women who found the result worth the risk and who were operating within a system of incentives that made the risk feel, in the moment, less real than the consequences of not looking right. This is one of the most consistent threads in the history of Victorian women's beauty culture, the willingness to accept physical risk in exchange for social safety, because that is what the rules were about, ultimately, not beauty in any abstract sense, safety. The safety of being read correctly, being placed correctly, being recognized as the right kind of woman in the right kind of world. The risks of the beauty preparations were uncertain and delayed. The risks of failing to conform were immediate and certain. Now let us go into the world. Let us follow our Victorian woman out of her dressing room and into her day, because the beauty rules did not stop at the mirror. They governed everything that happened once she left the house. The gloves, we cannot pass over the gloves. In the Middle Victorian period, wearing gloves in public was not a choice or a fashion statement. It was a social obligation as absolute as any other in the long list of things that could not be discussed but that everyone understood. A woman's bare hands were not to be seen outside her own home. The gloves covered them from wrist to fingertip, or from partway up the forearm if the sleeve was short, which was rare in daytime, and they were expected to be appropriate to the occasion, clean and in good repair. The rules about which gloves for which occasion were intricate and specific. Kid gloves, made from the very soft leather of kidskin, were the finest and were required for the most formal occasions, for morning calls, and for any social encounter where the impression made truly mattered. They came in a range of colors that were themselves subject to regulation. Pale colors were almost always correct, and among pale colors white was the most formal, cream was softer and more forgiving, Pale grey was a good general choice for slightly less formal occasions. Pale lavender was appropriate for semi-morning. Strong colours in gloves were more unusual and carried more character, more risk. Cotton gloves were acceptable for less formal occasions and for activities that might damage finer leather. In summer, lightweight lisle cotton was common. In winter, thicker gloves in wool or heavier cotton served for outdoor warmth, but the fine pair still had to come along for any indoor occasion because you took the outdoor gloves off at the door. The care of gloves was its own practice. Leather gloves were cleaned with breadcrumbs rubbed gently across the surface, or with a specially prepared cleaning compound sold at glovers' establishments. They were stored flat or on glove stretchers, small hand-shaped wooden or bone forms over which the gloves were stretched while damp to restore their shape. A glove that wrinkled at the wrist or bagged at the fingers was not a glove that could be worn, and the woman who appeared with imperfect gloves had committed a small but visible failure. Taking gloves off and putting them on was itself a performance. There was a correct way to remove a glove, working the fingers down from the tips, peeling it backward off the hand, rolling it loosely rather than turning it completely inside out, tucking it into the other glove when both were off, and placing them together in the hands or in the bag rather than simply dropping them on the nearest surface. A woman who yanked at her gloves in a hurry was communicating something unflattering about herself. The handshake, performed with gloves on, was its own small code. A firm handshake between women was perfectly acceptable, though very vigorous shaking was considered a little masculine. Offering the hand for a gentleman to kiss, bowing over the gloved hand rather than shaking it, was a formality that had been more common earlier in the century and was becoming old-fashioned by the 1870s and 1880s, though it persisted in certain aristocratic and court contexts. The presentation of the hand for this purpose required a particular angle, a slight turn of the wrist that offered the back of the hand upward, and the management of this angle with naturalness was a skill acquired in girlhood. The fan was another extension of the body's vocabulary, another instrument for communicating what could not be said. The Victorian era was not the heyday of elaborate fan language. The most codified systems of fan-based communication belonged to earlier centuries and to Spanish and Italian rather than English tradition, but the fan served its functions nonetheless. It covered the mouth during an expression of shock or horror that propriety suggested should be contained. It provided something to do with the hands during conversation when gesturing too broadly was considered forward. It moved air across a warm face without the vulgarity of wiping sweat from the brow, and it served as a means of timing. Closing a fan with a small snap could signal the end of a visit or a conversation without words being required for the purpose. The combination of gloves, fan, parasol, handkerchief, and reticule, the small bag carried by Victorian women since the high-waisted fashions of the early century had eliminated the possibility of internal pockets in most gowns, meant that a Victorian woman's hands were almost never simply at rest at her sides. They always held something. They always managed something. The management of these objects was so continuous and so practiced that it became invisible, which was the aim. Let us now enter a Victorian parlour in the afternoon and sit with what social calling actually required. Because the elaborate preparations of the morning, the skincare, the hair, the corset, the gloves, all of them were pointing toward this. This was the arena where the appearance had to perform. Afternoon calls began after 2 and ended before 5, and the rules about them were precise enough to fill an entire section of any etiquette manual. You called at the right time of day, you stayed the right length of time, which was somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes for a standard call, shorter if the hostess seemed occupied, longer only if invited to stay and the occasion warranted. You brought your calling card and left it, whether you were received or not, so that your visit was known and could be reciprocated. You dressed for the call at the level appropriate to the relationship, a more elaborate afternoon gown for the calls that mattered most, something slightly plainer for intimate friends you saw regularly enough that ceremony would be strange. In the parlour itself, you sat with your back straight. The corset helped, but it did not do all the work. Posture was a constant, active physical practice. You sat with your feet together or with your ankles crossed, never with your legs spread apart or stretched out in front of you. You sat toward the front of the chair rather than leaning back into it, because leaning back looked slovenly and because the back of the chair, if upholstered, might disarrange your hair or disturb the trim at the back of your collar. Your hands were in your lap or managing the cup and saucer if tea was served. Your face was composed, not blank, that would be cold, but composed, pleasant, attending. The expression was a managed thing, like everything else. You were expected to look interested in the conversation without looking so fascinated that you seemed to have no inner life of your own. You were expected to smile frequently, but not so frequently that the smile lost its value as signal. You did not show strong emotion except at moments where emotion was clearly warranted, and even then you showed a controlled version of it, the version that communicated feeling while still communicating management of feeling. This is one of the great unspoken beauty rules of the Victorian era, and perhaps the one that was most pervasive and most demanding. The face itself was expected to be managed. The emotions that crossed it were expected to be curated. A woman who showed what she actually felt at any given moment was showing bad manners, not authenticity. There is a phrase from conduct manuals of the period that I find genuinely striking every time I encounter it: the management of the countenance. The face is treated as a surface to be managed, like a household, like a budget, like a social obligation. The emotions are real, presumably, they just require management before public expression. The laugh that goes too long or too loud, the irritation that shows in the set of the jaw, the boredom that softens the eyes during a dull conversation. All of these were failures of management, small breaches of the etiquette that governed the face as much as it governed the clothes. And the smile is worth its own paragraph. The Victorian smile, as captured in photographs of the era, looks odd to modern eyes. Portraits and formal photographs almost universally show either a closed-mouth expression or a very small, constrained smile. We tend to attribute this to the long exposure times required by early photography. The subject could not hold a broad smile for the length of time the photograph required, and so they did not try. But it was more than technical. The broad, open-mouthed smile, the kind that shows teeth, that creases the eyes, that takes over the whole face, was considered undignified in formal contexts throughout most of the Victorian era. The laugh that showed teeth was associated with rowdiness, with the theatre, with public spaces where people let themselves go. In the parlour, in the portrait studio, in any situation where the record of appearance was being made permanently, the expression was controlled. What this meant in practice was that Victorian women were managing, constantly, the distance between what the face wanted to do and what the face was permitted to show. This is exhausting in a way that is hard to fully appreciate from outside it, because the management is so continuous that it eventually becomes second nature, and second nature becomes invisible to the person doing it, and invisible effort is simply the texture of being alive. The teeth themselves were a matter of concern in a period when dental medicine was limited and dental hygiene was understood but not always well practiced. Tooth powders, the predecessors of modern toothpaste, were available and widely used. Some were relatively benign, made from chalk and flavouring. Some were more abrasive, made from pumice or brick dust, and cleaned the enamel away along with the stain. Charcoal-based powders were popular and actually somewhat effective for whitening. Prepared tooth powders in tins could be purchased from pharmacies and from the same retailers who sold the other beauty preparations. Bad teeth were a social liability in the Victorian era in a way that is recognizable from our own time, but the solutions were more limited and more drastic. Extraction was common and early. A toothache was often simply extracted away rather than treated, and the resulting gaps were managed, if the woman had the resources, with false teeth. Victorian dentures were made from a range of materials: ivory, animal bone, porcelain, and sometimes, distressingly, the teeth of dead soldiers collected from battlefields, which were known as Waterloo teeth for their supposed origin after the 1815 battle. The fit of Victorian dentures was imperfect by modern standards, and the appearance convincing only at some distance, but they were better than the alternative of obvious absence. The rule about the teeth connects directly back to the rule about the smile. You showed only enough to be pleasant, never enough to reveal. Now let us follow our Victorian woman back home at the end of the afternoon, and into the evening preparations, because the evening had its own entirely separate set of rules that required their own entirely separate set of performances. The transition from afternoon to evening dress was not a casual affair. It was not a matter of changing from one outfit into another comfortable one. It was a second full transformation, as considered and as elaborate as the morning one, and it was timed with care to ensure completion before the evening's activities began. For a dinner at home or a dinner party elsewhere, the change typically happened between 6 and 7 in the evening, giving time for the maid to help with the more complicated elements, the unlacing of the day's corset and the relacing of the evening one, the rearranging of the hair from its daytime shape into the evening style, the addition of the jewelry that would not have been appropriate during the afternoon. The evening corset might be different from the day corset, slightly lower cut at the bust, laced a little more precisely to produce the cleanest possible line under the evening gown, which was itself cut to show the upper chest and shoulders in a way the daytime dress never would. The evening gown required, therefore, a different calibration of everything beneath it. The hair for the evening was usually more elaborate than the daytime arrangement, or differently elaborate, a little higher perhaps, to give the neck more length above the neckline of the gown. Additional false hair might be incorporated that had not been worn during the day. Ornaments, combs, pins, small flowers of silk, or real ones if the season and the occasion permitted, were added. The jewelry. Victorian jewelry had its own rules, as complex as every other system we have looked at. Pearls were perhaps the most consistent of the era's recommendations. They complemented pale skin. They were appropriate at nearly every social level that could afford them. They came in sizes and qualities that ranged from the grand to the modest, and their quiet luster was considered to enhance rather than compete with the complexion. A string of pearls around the throat of an evening gown was never wrong. A matched set of pearl earrings and brooch was a safe choice for almost any occasion. Gold and precious gemstones were more occasion-specific. The more formal the event, the more jewelry was appropriate and the more significant the stones. But the rules were also about balance. Too much jewelry was its own kind of failure, a suggestion of either insecurity or vulgarity. A woman wearing everything at once because she was not confident enough to choose. The edit was important. The choice of what not to wear was as significant as what was worn. Jet, the smooth black gemstone found in large quantities on the Yorkshire coast at Whitby, was the mandatory jewellery of mourning. The regulations around mourning dress were as elaborate as any other system in the Victorian world, and they were perhaps the most stringent in their requirement for conformity, because the depth of visible grief was read as evidence of character. The bereaved widow who appeared in anything other than deep mourning black in the first year after her husband's death was making a statement about the marriage that the world would notice and comment upon. Jet brooches, jet earrings, jet bracelets, sometimes jet hairpins, all of these were available from the Whitby industry that had grown up specifically to supply the Victorian mourning market. The quality of Whitby jet was high enough to be sought after even outside mourning contexts. Its warmth of colour, its light weight, and the ease with which it could be carved made it a valued material in its own right. But its primary market was grief, and the industry around it gives a particular glimpse into the commercial economy of Victorian emotion. Sorrow packaged, regulated, commodified, and sold at the appropriate price point, back to the evening. The dinner party itself required its own management of all these elements simultaneously: the dress, the hair, the jewellery, the complexion, the posture, the expression, the conversation. A Victorian woman at a dinner party was performing at peak complexity, navigating the strictest version of all the invisible rules at once, and the performance had to look like ease. The table manner was a performance within a performance. The way food was conveyed from plate to mouth, a woman ate with small, delicate bites. She never loaded her fork fully. She never spoke with her mouth occupied. She did not gesture with her implements. She placed her fork and knife precisely when she paused. All of this was as much a part of the appearance as anything she wore. The body at the dinner table was as thoroughly regulated as the body at the dressing table. Wine was consumed but moderately, and the consumption was itself regulated by the same logic that governed everything else: enough to be sociable, never enough to become visible as consumption. A woman who visibly enjoyed her wine was edging toward territory that made people uncomfortable. Appetite in general, for food, for wine, for anything physical, was a quality to be concealed behind the performance of having it under control. The conversation at dinner was subject to rules about topic that varied by the seriousness of the gathering. Politics were generally avoided unless the company was very specifically political. Religion was treated with care. Personal gossip, the real currency of Victorian social exchange, was acceptable in measured doses, but not as the dominant mode. The goal in dinner conversation, as in so much else, was to appear interested in the person you were speaking with, interested in whatever topic they raised, and to express that interest without revealing anything that could be used against you later. This sounds paranoid when stated plainly, and it is not quite that. It is rather the logic of a social system in which reputation was fragile and memory was long, in which things said in one context resurfaced in another, in which the woman who spoke too freely at dinner in October might find the consequences of that freedom arriving at her door in February. The management of what you revealed about yourself was a form of self-protection, and it was continuous. Now let us think about what all of this cost, because the beauty rules of the Victorian era, from the cold cream at the dressing table to the managed smile at the dinner party, from the gloves in the street to the corseted posture in the parlor, they were not simply about how women looked, they were about what women were required to be, and the distance between what the rules required and what a human being can naturally sustain without effort was the space in which enormous quantities of daily labor were being expended invisibly. There is a phrase I keep returning to when I think about this period. It comes from a different context. The sociologist Arlie Hochschild coined the term emotional labor in the 1980s to describe the management of emotion required in service professions, but it fits Victorian women's experience with uncomfortable precision. They were doing continuous emotional labor on their faces, in their voices, in their posture, in the management of their own appetites and expressions and reactions. And like the domestic work that supported the household, this labor was invisible precisely because it was being done well. The smooth social surface was the evidence of the work, not the work itself. Victorian women also did something that we might call appearance labor, the continuous physical work of preparing, maintaining, and presenting the acceptable self. The hour at the dressing table each morning was not relaxation, it was skilled work. The hair needed to be dressed correctly, the skin needed to be prepared correctly, the dress needed to be chosen correctly for the day's activities, the gloves needed to be right, the hat needed to be right. Each element was a decision. Each decision required knowledge, and the knowledge had been acquired over years of observation and correction and practice. The correction happened early. Victorian girls were taught the rules of appearance from childhood, partly explicitly by mothers and governesses and conduct books, and partly by watching and absorbing the world around them. They learnt what was right by encountering what was wrong, by the slight cooling in a mother's manner when a hair was out of place, by the specific silence that fell in a room when someone appeared who had got something wrong. The rules were transmitted through atmosphere as much as through instruction, and they were transmitted with the implicit understanding that getting it right was not optional. A woman who dressed incorrectly, who managed her appearance carelessly, who allowed the seams to show, was not simply making a personal choice about style. She was failing at something that had consequences, social consequences, material consequences, consequences for her standing, her marriage prospects, her husband's reputation, her children's futures. The pressure was real because the stakes were real. This is perhaps the hardest thing to hold in mind simultaneously, that the rules were arbitrary and culturally constructed, and also that the consequences of breaking them were not arbitrary at all. They were very real. And the women who navigated them most successfully were not the ones who felt the rules most lightly, but often the ones who had internalized them most completely, who had made the performance so thoroughly their own that it no longer registered as performance. Let us talk about the bath, or rather, let us talk about what bathing meant in the Victorian era, because it was not what it is now, and the rules around it were, like everything else, more complicated than they appear on the surface. The image of the Victorians as a people who bathed infrequently is both true and misleading. True, in that the kind of daily immersion bathing that is now the Western norm, a shower or bath every morning as a matter of absolute routine, was not Victorian practice. Not because Victorians were unaware of the value of cleanliness, but because access to hot water in sufficient quantities for a full bath was a logistical challenge that most households below the upper middle class navigated carefully. In a house with servants and a plumbed bathroom, which had become more common for the prosperous classes from the 1860s and 1870s onwards, a woman might bathe weekly or perhaps twice a week. In houses without running hot water, which included most working-class homes and many middle-class ones well into the late Victorian period. Bathing meant heating water on the stove, carrying it in pitchers or pails to a portable tin bath placed in the bedroom or kitchen, and managing the wash with what was available. Daily washing, as opposed to bathing, was more universal and more thorough than its reputation suggests. The morning wash, face, neck, hands, arms, happened at the washstand in the bedroom, using a basin and pitcher. This was expected, practiced, and as much a part of the morning routine as anything else. Soap was used, the water was ideally warm, the towels were clean. The washstand itself, with its decorated ceramic basin and pitcher, and the matching soap dish and toothbrush holder, was a furniture type so ubiquitous in the Victorian bedroom that the existence of running water in a house eventually made it redundant, and it disappeared as a category. But for most of the Victorian period, it was the everyday face of personal hygiene for the majority of the population. The physical freedom of movement that the bicycle gave women was not a trivial thing. For the first time, large numbers of women were able to travel independently, at speed, under their own power, without a carriage and without an escort. The social consequences of this were noted anxiously by conservatives and welcomed eagerly by progressives, and the dress consequences were part of the same negotiation. By the end of the Victorian period, by the mid-1890s and into the brief Edwardian era before the Great War changed everything, the beauty rules were shifting. The silhouette had begun to relax slightly, the bustle was gone. The corset persisted, but was changing shape, moving from the waist-cinching configuration of the high Victorian era toward the long-line corset that redistributed pressure differently across the body. The enormous sleeves of the early 1890s were contracting. The hat was still there, still obligatory, but its specific requirements were evolving. What remained constant was the underlying logic that women's appearance required management, that the management required effort, that the effort must not show, that the standard was maintained by the invisible daily labor of the women who met it, and that failing to meet it carried real social consequences. This logic has not ended. It has changed its specific content. The particular standard is different, the specific rules are different, the most dangerous preparations are different, but the logic persists. We are still inside a world where women's appearance is subject to management and judgment in ways that men's is not, where the effort required to meet the standard is invisible and therefore uncredited, where the consequences of falling short are social rather than physical but are real nonetheless. Understanding the Victorian version of this does not solve it, but it does make it legible. It places our own moment within a longer history, and that longer view can be, in its own way, useful. It tells us that these rules are not natural. They were constructed, they changed through the Victorian period itself, they were negotiated and pushed at and occasionally broken. Rules that are constructed can be reconstructed differently, but perhaps more immediately, more personally. It reminds us of the women who lived inside all of this, who put on their corsets and arranged their hair and applied their cold cream and put on their gloves and went out into the world and managed their expressions and came home again and took it all off with a relief that fills the room even across the century and a half between them and us. They were not simple, they were not one thing, they were doing the best they could with what they had been given, in the only world they knew, finding what pleasures they could find inside it, resisting what they could resist, enduring what they had to endure. They were, in other words, people, complicated, resourceful, sometimes exhausted, sometimes joyful, sometimes both at once people, and I think they deserve to be seen. So here we are, finally, at the end of the day. The evening has come around again, the candle is lower, the fire is banked, the dressing table is waiting for the cold cream and the brush and the pins, and in the morning the whole extraordinary project of the Victorian woman's appearance will begin again from the beginning. But right now, in this particular moment that we have been sharing, it is quiet. You are in your bed, or wherever you have settled to hear this. The world outside is doing whatever it does at this hour, in whatever season holds you, and somewhere across all the years, a woman in a London bedroom is brushing out her hair for the 100 strokes, counting under her breath, feeling the day's structure loosen around her, becoming briefly and finally, privately herself. I hope you have found something in her world tonight, something that surprised you, or moved you, or simply held you in the comfortable way that good history can hold you. Not threatening, not alarming, just present, just real, just the texture of other human lives laid alongside your own for a little while. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one. End of script. Sleepy old world, unspoken beauty rules of Victorian women. Approximate word count, moan 30,000 words. Extended narration, additional sections. Actually wait, I do not want to leave yet. There is more to say, and the night is long enough. Because there are corners of the Victorian beauty world we have not yet entered, rooms we have only looked at from the doorway, and some of them are the most interesting rooms of all. Let us talk about the hairdresser. Not the lady's maid who dressed hair at home, but the professional hairdresser, an increasingly significant figure in the Victorian social landscape as the period progressed, and one whose existence tells us something important about the commercialization of Victorian women's appearance. Hairdressing as a professional service for women had existed in various forms through the 18th century, but it expanded enormously during the Victorian era in response to the growing complexity of fashionable hairstyles and the expanding middle class that wanted access to fashionable styling without the capacity to employ a full-time lady's maid. The professional hairdresser served both the elaborate needs of the genuinely wealthy on important occasions and the everyday needs of middle-class women who came in weekly or fortnightly to have their hair dressed. The hairdressing establishment, the salon, though that word in its modern sense was not used until later, was a particular kind of space. It was somewhere between a shop and a private interior, somewhere between a commercial transaction and an intimate service. A woman who visited a hairdresser was submitting her head, quite literally, to a stranger's hands, and this required a degree of trust and a code of discretion. The hairdresser was expected to be skilled, to be discreet, and to be in every other way essentially invisible as a person, present as a service rather than as an individual. This invisibility was a professional requirement rather than a personal slight, but it sat within the broader Victorian logic we have been examining, in which the labour required to produce an appearance was expected to be unacknowledged. The woman left the hairdressing establishment with her hair done, and the story she told in the world was simply that her hair was well dressed, not that she had paid someone to dress it. The products used in Victorian hairdressing establishments were similar to those used at home, but often of higher quality and more varied application. Pomades and brilliantines, preparations based on petroleum jelly or wax or oil, were used to smooth and add shine. Crimping irons and curling tongs, heated on small spirit lamps or in the coals of a fire, were used to create the waves and curls that the era required. The heat of these implements was managed by experienced hands that had developed an instinct for the right temperature, but burns to the hair and occasionally to the scalp were a recognized occupational hazard on both sides of the operation. The crimping iron produced a close, regular wave pattern that was fashionable for the front hair and for the fringe during certain periods of the era. A fringe, a cut fringe rather than a natural one, the hair at the front of the head cut short and dressed forward over the forehead, became fashionable in the 1880s after Princess Alexandra of Wales was seen to adopt it, reportedly to cover a small scar on her forehead. The princess's influence on Victorian fashion was significant and immediate. Within months, a fringe was required by anyone who wanted to be current, and the hairdressers of England were busy cutting. This is one of the mechanisms by which Victorian beauty rules propagated and changed, through the visible choices of women of rank whose appearance was reported in the newspapers and in the illustrated press. The Illustrated London News, the Queen, the Lady, these publications carried detailed descriptions and sometimes illustrations of fashionable dress and hair at significant public occasions, and women who read them understood these descriptions as prescriptive as well as descriptive. Princess Alexandra was a particular influence because she was genuinely beautiful and genuinely interested in dress, and because her choices were made visible in a way that most aristocratic women's were not. The fringe was one example. The dog collar, the very high necklace worn close to the throat, was another, and this one was also reportedly adopted first by the princess to cover a small scar at her neck. Whether these origin stories are true or embellished does not particularly matter. What matters is that they circulated, and that they gave the fashion both a royal warrant and a human narrative, a reason for the choice that made it more than simply fashionable. The transmission of fashion through the Victorian period depended on these mechanisms of visible example, royal and aristocratic dress reported in the press, fashion plates in women's magazines illustrating the current silhouette, paper patterns, and dressmaking guides, allowing women to reproduce fashionable styles at home. It was slower and more hierarchical than the instantaneous democratic circulation of trends that characterizes the contemporary fashion world, but it was not static, and the women who navigated it developed a sophisticated literacy of what was current and what was not. Now let us spend some time with Victorian women's relationship to exercise and the body, because this is another area where the rules were intricate and where what was officially permitted and what was actually done were not always the same thing. The official Victorian position on women's exercise was complicated by conflicting imperatives. On one hand, medical opinion throughout the period emphasized the importance of fresh air and physical activity for women's health. On the other hand, the fashionable silhouette and the clothing required to produce it were genuinely incompatible with vigorous movement, and hovering over everything was the persistent social anxiety about women doing things, physical, strenuous things that were considered masculine. Walking was universally approved. A genteel walk, taken at a pace that did not produce visible exertion, with a maid or companion and a parasol against the sun, was not only acceptable but recommended. Women's medical guides throughout the Victorian period suggested daily walking for health, typically for an hour at least in the morning or early afternoon. This walking was supposed to produce gentle movement, improved digestion, a becoming colour in the cheeks, but not sweat, not shortness of breath, not anything that would require a rest and a glass of water. The rules about the colour in the cheeks, by the way, illustrate exactly the paradox at the heart of Victorian standards. A healthy glow from exercise was considered attractive and was medically endorsed, but the same kind of colour produced by excessive heat or by the summer sun was not. The first was vigour, the second was exposure. The difference was in the cause rather than the appearance, and the woman who knew the rules understood this distinction even though it was not written anywhere. Croquet became one of the defining leisure activities of the Victorian middle classes from the 1860s onward, and its appeal was partly about the combination of gentle exercise, outdoor social activity, and a structure that made mixed-gender interaction natural and acceptable. The rules of croquet required no particular athletic exertion. The swings were small, the pace was leisurely, and the fashionable dress of the period was fully compatible with it. Women could play croquet in their ordinary afternoon dress without any modification, which made it ideal. Archery was similarly approved. It required a particular stance, a particular kind of concentrated stillness, and produced no unseemly running or visible breathlessness. The archery ground at a country house party was one of the social spaces where women could demonstrate skill and compete on something approaching equal terms with the men present, which was considered enjoyable and harmless, partly because archery was sufficiently theatrical. The targets, the equipment, the specialized costumes sometimes adopted for the activity to feel like performance rather than sport. Swimming existed, but was regulated to a degree that makes its Victorian version almost unrecognizable. Sea bathing, which had been popular since the 18th century and which was enthusiastically endorsed throughout the Victorian period on medical grounds, happened from bathing machines, large wheeled huts that were pulled by horses into the water, allowing the bather to descend steps directly into the sea without crossing the beach in her bathing costume and without being seen by any member of the public who was not in the water themselves. The Victorian bathing costume was a substantial garment, a knee-length dress in heavy cotton, usually dark in colour to resist the transparency that seawater produced, worn over drawers that covered the legs to the knee. It was not designed for swimming in any vigorous sense, and most Victorian sea bathing consisted of ducking in the waves, rather than any actual swimming stroke. The medical advice about sea bathing tended to emphasize the therapeutic value of cold salt water itself, its bracing, restorative, constitutional benefits, rather than the exercise involved in any movement through it. The beach, despite all of this management, was one of the few places where the Victorian dress requirements were genuinely relaxed. The special permission of the seaside, the long tradition of health-seeking that gave it a medical excuse, the distance from the social circles of ordinary life, the particular quality of the holiday as a time outside the usual rules, allowed a degree of undress, a degree of informality, a degree of exposure to the elements that was simply not possible elsewhere. Children paddled, adults might paddle. The boots and stockings came off at the water's edge, and the feet went into the sea. This was the limit of exposure for most respectable women at most Victorian beaches, bare feet in the waves. But it was a limit pushed regularly enough that the photographs of Victorian seaside visits have a particular quality of suppressed lightness about them, as though everyone involved understood they were doing something that felt briefly free. Let us talk about what happened to Victorian beauty culture when a woman was ill, because illness was common, and it intersected with the beauty rules in ways that were both practically significant and socially revealing. A sick woman, confined to bed or to the house, receiving visitors or not receiving them, depending on the nature and severity of the illness, occupied a particular social position. The rules of appearance partially relaxed, in the way they partially relaxed for very old age. It was understood that illness imposed its own constraints, that a woman who was genuinely unwell could not be expected to maintain the full performance of health and grooming. But the relaxation was partial and conditional. A woman who was receiving visitors while ill, and many illnesses in an era without antibiotics or effective medical intervention were long, lingering affairs that allowed a moderate degree of receiving, was still expected to manage her appearance to the degree her condition permitted. The bed jacket we discussed in an earlier imagining of this history, the soft, lacy garment worn in bed above the nightgown for exactly this purpose, existed as a solution to the problem of maintaining some degree of dress standards while genuinely confined to bed. The particular social performance of invalidism was its own art in the Victorian era. The delicate invalid, pale, languid, receiving visitors from a chaise longue or a carefully arranged bed, was a recognized and even romanticized figure. The consumption of tuberculosis, the great fatal disease of the 19th century, produced a particular aesthetic of illness that was genuinely incorporated into Victorian beauty standards. The hectic flush in otherwise pale cheeks, the brightness of fever in the eyes, the ethereal thinness of the wasted body were considered, by some, and in some of the literature of the period, beautiful in a way that makes us uncomfortable to read now. This aestheticization of illness was neither universal nor unchallenged. There was always a strong strand of Victorian medical and social thinking that associated illness with moral failure, insufficient hardiness, insufficient care of the constitution, insufficient application of those bracing habits of fresh air and exercise that the health manuals recommended. A woman who became ill too easily was sometimes read as having let herself down in some way, as having failed to maintain the physical resilience that good women were supposed to possess. But for the genuinely ill woman, the performance was real. You were sick, and you were also still expected to manage your appearance, to be seen by visitors in an acceptable state, to demonstrate that even illness was not sufficient cause to abandon the standards entirely. The appearance of graceful illness, the hair neatly braided, the bed jacket clean and pretty, the face arranged in an expression of dignified endurance, was itself a performance of femininity, and it was one that required effort that the sick woman could often barely summon. Victorian medical treatment intersected with the beauty rules in several specific ways. Some treatments actively damaged the appearance in ways that required additional management. The mercury preparations used for certain skin conditions, including the treatment of syphilis, which was widespread and not discussed in polite company, could cause the hair to fall out and the skin to deteriorate. The arsenic treatments used for certain conditions. Arsenic was genuinely used medicinally throughout the Victorian period, including famously in Fowler's solution, a preparation prescribed for various conditions including skin complaints and malaria, produced effects on the complexion that could be either beneficial or damaging depending on the dose and the duration. The doctors were doing their best. The best available was often genuinely harmful in ways they did not understand. And the women at the receiving end were navigating both the illness and the treatment and the beauty rules simultaneously with the same resources of resilience and management that they applied to everything else. There is a sadness in this that I do not want to rush past. The women who developed rosacea and tried the preparations that made it worse. The women who used the whitening powders that poisoned them gradually. The women who were treated for their skin conditions with preparations that damaged their hair. They were not foolish. They were working within the knowledge available to them, and the knowledge was wrong, and there was no way to know that it was wrong without information they did not have access to. This is one of the places where historical compassion becomes genuinely important, not the projecting backwards compassion that finds earlier periods simply cruel or limited, but the compassion that recognizes the people of earlier times as doing the best they could with what they had, and sometimes being failed by what they had in ways that were tragic and real. Let us spend some time now with a topic that sits at the intersection of Victorian beauty and Victorian science, which is the question of how Victorian women thought about the relationship between their appearance and their health, because these were not separate domains in the Victorian mind. Appearance was health in an important sense, health was appearance, and the beauty preparations were also health preparations, and the health practices were also beauty practices. The Victorian era was a period of genuine and exciting scientific progress in medicine and public health. Germ theory, established by the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch from the 1860s onwards, was transforming medical understanding in real time during this period. The great sanitary reforms of the mid-Victorian period, improved water supplies, the new sewer systems, the regulation of food and housing, were genuinely effective at reducing rates of infectious disease and extending life expectancy in visible, measurable ways. But the uptake of these ideas by ordinary people was slow and uneven, and the older frameworks for understanding health, the theory of miasma, disease arising from bad air, the theory of the bodily humours, health as a balance of 4 basic fluids, the general belief that morality and constitution were intimately connected, did not disappear overnight. They persisted alongside the new scientific understanding, and many Victorian women navigated a landscape in which both old and new explanations were available, and neither was yet entirely authoritative. Within this confused but energetic intellectual environment, the beauty preparations that women used were understood to be doing something to the body as a whole, not just to the surface. Cold cream was not merely cosmetic, it was protecting the skin from the bad air that caused illness, keeping the body's outer boundary intact and functional. Glycerin was not merely moisturizing, it was maintaining the skin's constitutional properties, its ability to protect what was inside from what was outside. The distinction between cosmetic and medicinal preparations was much less clear in the Victorian period than it is in ours, partly because the regulatory frameworks that now enforce these distinctions did not yet exist, and partly because the theoretical basis for the distinction was genuinely blurry. Products were advertised across the boundary in both directions, medical preparations that also promised cosmetic benefits, cosmetic preparations that also promised health benefits. This blurring was not simply commercial cynicism, though it was partly that. It reflected a genuine Victorian belief in the connection between beauty and health that is not entirely without modern validation. We now know that certain skin preparations do have genuine physiological effects, that sunscreen actually does prevent sun damage and skin cancer, that some antioxidants in skin preparations do provide some protection against oxidative stress, that good hydration of the skin does have measurable effects on its barrier function. The Victorians were operating with a much less sophisticated version of this understanding, but the underlying intuition that what you put on your skin matters to your health and not just your appearance was not wrong. The air quality question was perhaps the most significant. Victorian London's air was genuinely toxic by modern standards. The combination of coal fire emissions from millions of domestic hearths and thousands of industrial chimneys produced what were called pea superfogs in the worst winters, thick yellow-grey miasmas of smoke and moisture and sulfur dioxide that reduced visibility to a few yards and that could kill vulnerable people in significant numbers. The Great Fog of 1952, which killed an estimated 4,000 people in London in 5 days, was the last major episode of this kind, but it was a continuation of conditions that had existed throughout the Victorian period and that were only partially remediated by the Clean Air Acts. Against this backdrop, the Victorian woman's careful management of her skin, the twice-daily cleansing that removed accumulated soot and pollutants, the barrier preparations that protected the skin surface during outdoor exposure, was not merely cosmetic vanity. It was a response to a genuine environmental threat, and the women who maintained these practices were probably on balance better off for them. The question of diet and its relationship to beauty is one that the Victorian beauty manuals addressed with considerable energy, because the period was one of genuine interest in the relationship between what you ate and how you looked. The advice offered was a mixture of the genuinely sound and the genuinely wrong. On the sound side, plenty of water, plenty of fresh vegetables and fruit, moderate quantities of meat, avoidance of very rich or very sweet foods, regular meals at regular times. These recommendations, if followed, would have produced a reasonably healthy diet by modern nutritional standards, and the connection between diet and skin clarity that the beauty manuals emphasized, eat well, drink water, and your complexion will improve, is not without genuine basis. On the wrong side, the belief that certain foods were dangerously heating to the blood and should be avoided for cosmetic reasons, spiced foods, rich foods, acidic foods, the belief that constipation was the cause of almost every skin problem and therefore that regular purgation was beneficial. It was not, and the purgatives available ranged from merely unpleasant to genuinely harmful, and the persistent belief that the color of certain foods could literally affect the color of the skin, so that eating too many red berries might somehow produce redness of complexion. The connection between the gut and the skin, between what we now call the gut microbiome and various skin conditions, is actually an area of genuinely active modern research, and it turns out to be real. Victorian intuitions that skin problems often had a digestive component were not entirely wrong, though the mechanisms they proposed were entirely wrong, and the treatments they derived from those mechanisms were at best ineffective and at worst harmful. The sleep question was another area of intersection between health and appearance that the beauty manuals treated seriously. Sufficient sleep was endorsed on both medical and cosmetic grounds. Insufficient sleep was believed to cause pallor, to produce dark circles under the eyes, to make the complexion dull and the hair lank, and to produce an expression of exhaustion that could not be managed away by any preparation. The prescribed amount of sleep varied slightly between sources, but generally settled around 8 hours, and the importance of a regular bedtime was emphasized. This advice, once again, is not wrong. Sleep deprivation does produce the cosmetic consequences described, and the mechanisms by which it does so, reduced blood flow to the skin, reduced production of collagen, increased cortisol levels, are well understood now, though they were not in the Victorian period. The Victorians were right about the effect and wrong about the explanation, which is a pattern we keep encountering. Let us now consider the Victorian woman in relation to fashion specifically, not the broad movements of silhouette that we have touched on, but the more granular question of how fashion was consumed and interpreted at the individual level. The fashion plate was the primary medium through which fashionable dress was communicated to women who were not part of the highest social circles and who could not attend the balls and court presentations at which fashionable dress was most elaborately displayed. Fashion plates, the illustrated pages in women's magazines showing the current fashions, typically as elegant figures in coloured illustrations, were produced in enormous quantities throughout the Victorian period. They were the Pinterest of their day, the Instagram, the place where the aspirational image of what fashion looked like was constructed and disseminated. And like all aspirational image media, they had a complicated relationship with reality. The figures in fashion plates were elongated, their proportions idealized, their postures impossibly elegant. The dresses they wore were depicted in color at a time when most women's wardrobes were more muted in tone than the fashion plate suggested. The accessories, the trims, the details, all of these were shown at their most elaborate, their most complete, their most composed. Women who read the fashion plates and tried to translate them into their actual wardrobes were negotiating every season between the ideal depicted and the reality available to them. The translation required pattern-making skills, fabric knowledge, access to the appropriate materials, and the judgment to understand which elements of the illustrated fashion were essential and which were elaborations that could be omitted or simplified without losing the essential quality of the look. Dressmaking, either doing it oneself or employing a dressmaker, was the means by which most Victorian women obtained their clothes. Ready-made clothing was available throughout the period, and increasingly so as the century progressed, but it was considered less desirable than made-to-measure for anything beyond the most basic garments. The fit of ready-made clothing over the Victorian corset was never quite right, because the corset changed the body's proportions in ways that were individual and that required individual calibration. The relationship between a Victorian woman and her dressmaker was one of the more important practical relationships in her life. A good dressmaker understood her client's body, her lifestyle, her social obligations, and her budget. She could translate the fashion plate into something wearable without making the client look as though she was wearing a costume. She kept the measurements and the notes about preferences and could produce garments quickly when occasion required. She was also, like the lady's maid and the hairdresser, expected to be discreet. What she saw of her clients' bodies and their concerns about them was not for public discussion. The dressmaker's fitting was another of those Victorian spaces of intimate physical management that were governed by the expectation of invisibility. You stood in your underthings while someone fitted fabric to your body, pinned and adjusted and assessed, and the whole process was conducted with the professional matter-of-factness that made it possible for the woman to submit to it without embarrassment. The fitting was not about the body, it was about the dress. The budget question was significant. Victorian women were not all equally resourced, and the fashion pressure was not equally experienced at every social level, but it was experienced at every social level, and the women who had the least resources for fashion felt the pressure as acutely as those who had the most, because the consequences of appearing dressed below the expectation of your social circle were social rather than absolute. A working-class woman who appeared in good condition for her class was meeting her standard. A middle-class woman who appeared dressed below the expectation of her class was failing her standard. The standard was relative, but the pressure was universal. Many Victorian women were skilled at making limited resources go a long way. The renovation of a dress, updating the trim, changing the sleeves, adding or removing ruffles to bring a gown of several seasons ago closer to the current silhouette, was a skilled and widely practiced economy. Pattern books and women's magazines carried regular advice on renovation, how to alter the set of a sleeve, how to respace the buttons when a new style required, how to add a fashionable element to an existing garment without making it look added on. The black silk dress, the one good black silk that many middle-class women kept for years and that could be renovated and re-renovated through several seasons, was practically a Victorian institution. Black silk did not show its age as quickly as coloured fabric. Black was always appropriate for a wide range of occasions. A well-made black silk with good trim could look affluent long after it was new, and the woman who maintained hers well could produce, when necessary, an impression of more wardrobe than she actually possessed. This kind of resourcefulness and this kind of management are, I think, easy to overlook when we focus on the most elaborate versions of Victorian dress. The court trains, the ball gowns, the elaborate morning dresses of the genuinely wealthy that fill the museum costume collections. The reality of Victorian dress for most women was something much more managed, much more economical, much more creative in its solutions to the problem of maintaining appearance on limited resources. Let us now spend some time with the question of perfumery in greater depth, because Victorian perfume culture is rich and specific enough to deserve more than the few paragraphs we gave it earlier. The Victorian approach to fragrance was shaped by a number of factors that are worth understanding separately. There was the class coding of strong fragrance that we discussed, the association of heavy, obvious scent with the theatre and with moral ambiguity. There was the technological context, in which the chemical analysis and synthesis of fragrance molecules was just beginning to become possible, producing a new range of synthetic scents that the perfumery industry was cautiously beginning to incorporate into its products. And there was the cultural context of the era's relationship with flowers and the natural world, which was deeply sentimental and deeply specific. Victorian flower language, the use of specific flowers to convey specific meanings, was an elaborate cultural system that probably reached its greatest elaboration in the 1820s and 1830s, but persisted throughout the Victorian period as a shared cultural vocabulary. The language of flowers informed, among other things, the scents considered appropriate for women, because the flowers associated with innocence, with delicacy, with domestic virtue were also the flowers whose scents were considered appropriate for respectable women to wear. Violets were the archetype, small, modest, purple, associated with modesty and faithfulness by the language of flowers. Their scent was considered one of the most appropriate for women throughout the Victorian era. Violet perfume, or rather violet water, because the extract of real violet flowers was expensive and difficult to work with, was the quintessential Victorian woman's fragrance, and it was produced in enormous quantities by every major perfumer of the period. The rose had a slightly more complicated status, too much association with romantic passion, which was not quite the message most contexts required, but still a fundamental fragrance in the Victorian perfumery repertoire. Rosewater, as we have noted, was used constantly in skin preparations and hair preparations, and its presence as a faint background note on a Victorian woman's skin was near universal among those who used it for those purposes. Lavender, as we have discussed, was clean and domestic and English. Lily of the Valley was innocent, spring-like, associated with purity. Sweet pea, jasmine in small quantities, honeysuckle, these were the light florals appropriate to the English idea of the natural feminine. Heavier, more exotic fragrances, oud, ambergris, musk in its animal form, were associated with the East, with the theatre, with a kind of sensuous excess that was not quite respectable. A woman who smelled of heavy oriental fragrances was broadcasting something about herself that polite society did not wish to hear. The manufacturing of Victorian perfume was transforming during this period, partly through the application of chemistry to fragrance, and partly through the changing economics of the industry. The town of Grasse in the south of France had been the centre of the French perfumery industry for centuries, growing flowers on an industrial scale and processing them through techniques of distillation and enfleurage, the process by which flower scent is absorbed by fat, which is then used to extract the fragrant compounds that were highly skilled and labour-intensive. The synthesis of coumarin in 1868, the compound responsible for the characteristic smell of freshly cut hay and of certain flowers, including tonka bean, was a watershed moment in perfumery. For the first time, a fragrance compound could be produced in a laboratory rather than grown and extracted. The implications were enormous. Synthetic fragrance was cheaper, more consistent, and potentially available in quantities that natural materials could never supply. The Victorian perfumery industry responded to this development with a mixture of enthusiasm and anxiety, the same mixture that every luxury industry feels when technology threatens its relationship with scarcity. The customers of Victorian perfumery were not generally aware of these debates, and most did not particularly care whether their violet water was made from natural violets or from a synthetic ironone compound that smelled like violets. What they cared about was the smell and the quality and the appropriateness to their social position, and the perfumers who understood this continued to thrive regardless of how they made their products. The packaging of Victorian perfume deserves attention as a separate topic, because it was itself a significant aspect of the product's appeal and of its social communication. Victorian perfume bottles were objects of beauty in their own right, pressed glass in the characteristic amber green of Victorian bottle glass, or clear glass with coloured stoppers, or occasionally the more expensive versions in cut crystal with silver tops hallmarked and engraved. The bottle on the dressing table was visible, and its quality communicated the same social signals as everything else on the dressing table. Rimmel in London was one of the most significant perfumers and beauty suppliers of the Victorian era, and the Rimmel catalogues of the period are wonderful documents of what was available and at what price. Eugene Rimmel, who ran the firm from his father's establishment through the mid to late Victorian period, was also a significant advocate for the use of non-toxic ingredients in cosmetics, publishing a pamphlet against the use of lead and mercury compounds that was both genuinely concerned with women's health and naturally commercially advantageous to a firm that was marketing safer alternatives. The beauty industry's relationship with safety, with the genuine tension between what worked and what was safe, runs throughout the Victorian period and is one of the threads that connects it most directly to our own moment. The lead powder was effective. The arsenic bleach was effective in a limited and terrible sense. The belladonna eye drops were effective. The value placed on effectiveness, combined with the social pressure that made effectiveness feel necessary, produced a market for harmful products that continued despite medical warning. The warning voices were there. The regulatory frameworks to enforce them were not. The Pure Food and Drug Act in the United States was not passed until 1906. In Britain, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 addressed adulteration of food and drugs but did not regulate cosmetics meaningfully. Women in the Victorian era were purchasing and using beauty preparations without any assurance that those preparations had been tested, that their ingredients were disclosed accurately, or that their effects had been studied. The buyer had almost no protection and almost no recourse. This made the informal networks of women's shared knowledge, the household book recipes, the letters between sisters, the advice passed from mother to daughter, not merely charming cultural artifacts, but genuinely important safety resources. A woman who made her own cold cream from ingredients she understood and sourced herself was in a safer position than a woman who trusted a commercially manufactured product whose ingredients were unknown to her. The homemade preparation might be less refined, but it was less likely to contain something hidden and harmful. Let us spend a little time with the specific and the particular, with individual women rather than with the general pattern, because the general pattern is only real insofar as it describes actual human beings who lived specific lives. There are women who left records that allow us to see the Victorian beauty rules from the inside. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, was a woman whose health was poor for much of her life, who spent years as an invalid in her father's house, and who was often excused from the full Victorian performance on medical grounds. Her letters from the period before her elopement with Robert Browning in 1846 describe a life conducted largely from her sofa or her bed, in loosened dress, without the full ritual of daily preparation. She was, by her own description, not a woman who thought much about her appearance during those years. And yet her surviving portraits show a woman carefully presented. The smooth hair, the neat collar, the composed expression. The photographs and portraits of Victorian women always carry this quality of managed presentation, and it is worth sitting with the question of what we can and cannot know from them. We can know what they looked like when carefully arranged and photographed or painted. We cannot know what they looked like in the morning before the preparation began, or in the evening after it was removed, or in the middle of a difficult day when the management had slipped. We see the construction, not the person inside it. The diaries of Eleanor Sidgwick, one of the earliest women to study at Cambridge, record the particular challenge of managing Victorian women's appearance requirements within a professional and intellectual life that the appearance requirements were not designed to accommodate. She was a serious scholar, deeply engaged with mathematics and philosophy, and she was also a Victorian woman who understood that her professional credibility was not separable from her social credibility, and that her social credibility was not separable from how she presented herself. She managed both. Her diary records her life as an almost comically full one, of committees and papers and college administration and domestic management and correspondence, and nowhere in it does the beauty routine appear as a significant time consumer, which suggests either that she had found a way to manage it very efficiently, or that it had become so habitual as to be beneath notice. The Queen herself, Victoria, is of course a figure who stands apart from the general pattern in most respects, and whose own relationship to the beauty rules of her era was shaped by her extraordinary position. Victoria was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of her time. She was short, in later life stout, with a round face and slightly protruding eyes. Her portraits from youth have a certain fresh prettiness, but she was not one of those monarchs whose personal beauty was a significant part of their public image. What is interesting about Victoria's relationship to appearance is not what she did that conformed to the rules, but what she permitted herself that did not. As a monarch, she could not be governed by the rules that governed her subjects, because the rules existed partly to mark social position, and her position was beyond marking. She wore black for 40 years after Albert's death. She adopted the Balmoral tartan as a personal fashion that no one else could replicate without looking eccentric. She was, in private, known to be less than rigidly corseted, which would have been unthinkable for any other woman of her class and position. But in her visible public persona, she conformed absolutely to the requirement of the managed appearance, and she understood perfectly the symbolic weight of dress and grooming. The occasions on which she appeared in state were occasions of full and elaborate presentation. The crown, the robes, the jewels, the entirely deliberate staging of sovereignty through appearance. She was, in this sense, the most extreme practitioner in the country of the principle that appearance is communication. Now let us talk about teeth more carefully, because I passed quickly over them earlier, and they deserve better. Dental health in the Victorian era was genuinely poor by modern standards, and this was not primarily a question of individual failure to clean teeth adequately. It was a question of diet, of the limited treatments available, and of the genuine difficulty of maintaining dental health without the understanding of oral microbiology that has shaped modern dental practice. Sugar consumption in Britain rose dramatically throughout the Victorian period, as industrialization made sugar cheaper and as the taste for sweet things spread from the wealthy to the middle and working classes. The association between sugar consumption and dental caries was observed in the period. Dentists noted that tooth decay was more prevalent in sugar-eating populations, but the mechanism was not understood, and the dietary advice available was therefore not very specific. Tooth cleaning was practiced, but the tools were not as effective as modern ones. Toothbrushes existed and were used, but the bristles were often hard enough to damage the enamel with vigorous use. Tooth powders and pastes varied enormously in their safety. Some were gentle chalk-based preparations that cleaned without damage. Others contained abrasives harsh enough to wear enamel away over time. The advice to clean teeth was sound. The implementations were uneven. The result was that tooth decay was extremely common, that extraction was the primary treatment for serious decay or pain, and that false teeth of various qualities were worn by a significant proportion of the Victorian adult population at levels that would astonish us now. The management of this situation within the beauty rules was an exercise in the familiar Victorian logic of concealment. The gaps were filled, the false teeth were fitted and worn as convincingly as possible, the smile was controlled to show as little as possible of whatever was shown. The controlled smile that we discussed earlier, the slightly constrained expression, the mouth not fully open, served partially this practical function. A woman who smiled broadly and freely might show what she had or did not have behind her lips, and the management of the smile was partly the management of that reveal. This does not mean that all Victorian women had poor teeth, or that the constrained smile was primarily about dental concealment. There were many other factors producing it, but it was one of the layers of the practice, and an honest account includes it. Breath was a related concern, managed by the same tooth powders and by various mouthwashes and breath sweeteners. Orris root, the dried root of the iris plant, which has a faint violet-like scent, was chewed as a breath freshener. Cardamom seeds served the same purpose. Fennel was used. The preparations available from pharmacies and perfumers included various formulations of mouthwash, and the instructions for their use emphasized frequency and regularity. The tooth powder advertisements of the period, like all Victorian beauty advertising, occupy that interesting space between the medical and the cosmetic. They promised clean teeth and sweet breath on health grounds, white teeth on beauty grounds, and the two framings were presented as aspects of the same thing rather than separate concerns, which is once again not entirely wrong. Good dental hygiene does contribute to both health and appearance, and the Victorians who sold products addressing both were addressing something real, even if their products were only partially effective. Let us now consider what happened at the boundaries of Victorian beauty culture, the moments where the rules broke down, where women found themselves in situations that the system had not anticipated and had to improvise. Travel was one of these moments. A Victorian woman travelling by railway, and the railway was transforming Victorian life through the middle and later decades of the century, making journeys possible that would previously have taken days instead of hours, encountered a set of practical difficulties that the beauty rules were not well designed to address. The railway carriage was dusty, smoky, and subjected to the vibration and jolting of the track in ways that played havoc with carefully arranged hair. The tunnels, of which there were many on most routes, filled the carriage with smoke and smuts. The engine's cinders fell on anything and anyone in the vicinity. Women travelling by railway wore travelling veils, strips of gauze or net attached to the hat that could be brought down over the face during the worst of the smoke and smuts, and raised again once the train was in the open. The travelling outfit was generally a slightly more practical version of normal dress, darker, simpler, less trimmed, that would withstand the rigours of the journey better than finest afternoon clothes. The picnic basket of provisions for a long journey was managed with gloves on, and then sometimes with gloves off, which required its own adjustment. Arriving after a long journey, the first task was the repair of what the journey had done. The recomposition at the end of the train journey, the dusting down of the skirt, the adjustment of the hat, the raising of the veil, the checking of the face and the small mirror in the handbag, was a familiar ritual, and a woman who stepped from a railway carriage looking entirely unruffled was considered to have managed a small triumph of feminine self-possession. Foreign travel was its own category. Victorian women who went abroad, and the growth of the tourist industry through the second half of the century, driven by the railways and by the development of Thomas Cook's package tour business, made foreign travel available to a much wider range of people than had ever travelled before, encountered beauty challenges that included different climates, different altitudes, different standards of available facilities, and occasionally the genuinely startling realization that the beauty rules were not universal. Mediterranean sunlight was stronger than English sunlight, and the risks to the pale complexion were correspondingly greater. The women who went to Italy or Greece or Egypt took their parasols and their travelling veils, but the sun was less manageable there, and the consequence was often that the complexion came back browner than it had left, which required management and comment, and the careful application of the bleaching preparations until the normal pale quality was restored. The encounter with other cultural standards of beauty was also, for some Victorian women, genuinely disorienting. The women of Egypt, of India, of West Africa used preparations on their faces and bodies that had their own logic and their own history, and the Victorian women who encountered them through travel or through the colonial context occupied a complicated position, both curious about and dismissive of other ways of being a woman, carrying with them the certainty that their own rules were the right ones, while sometimes being struck, privately and not always comfortably, by the fact that other systems of beauty existed and functioned differently. The caul that Egyptian and North African women used around their eyes was noted frequently in travel accounts, sometimes admiringly and sometimes not. It was one of the preparations that made its way back to England in luggage, used discreetly by women who had encountered it abroad and found its effect compelling. The aesthetic it produced, darker, more defined, more intensely dramatic than anything available in the standard English repertoire, was appealing for exactly the reasons it was also slightly suspect. It crossed a line that the Victorian rules about visible cosmetics maintained very carefully. Let us now speak about what the Victorian beauty rules meant for women who were not white, because this is a chapter of the history that is easy to omit and wrong to omit. The Victorian beauty standard was, in the most fundamental sense, a white standard. The pale complexion, the smooth, light skin, the particular features considered beautiful by the era's dominant culture, these were European features, and the system that made them the measure of beauty was the same system that made European culture the measure of civilization. The two projects were not separate. Women of colour in Victorian Britain, and there were more than popular imagination allows for, both from the colonies and from the long-established communities of African and mixed-race descent in British port cities, navigated a beauty standard that was not designed with them in mind, that frequently positioned their skin tone and features as deficiencies rather than as simply different, and that offered them the unpalatable choice between impossible conformity and the social consequences of its opposite. The whitening preparations that we have discussed throughout this journey, the arsenic wafers, the mercury-based bleaches, the bismuth powders, were used by some women of colour in the Victorian era for exactly the reasons they were used by everyone else who used them, because the social pressure to conform to the white standard of beauty was real, and because the consequences of failing to conform were real. The use of these preparations by women whose melanin made the gap between their natural skin tone and the standard larger was not vanity. It was desperation in some cases, and in other cases simply the same complex negotiation between personal identity and social requirement that all women were conducting in their own ways. There is a particular cruelty in this that I want to be honest about. The same system that constructed whiteness as beautiful also constructed whiteness as natural, as requiring no effort, as simply the default condition of the desirable woman. For white women, the effort of maintaining the pale complexion was considerable, the sun avoidance, the whitening preparations, the careful management, but the effort was hidden and the result could be presented as natural. For women of colour, the effort was greater and the result could never be fully convincing, because the gap between their natural appearance and the standard was structural rather than merely cosmetic. They were being measured by a standard designed for and by people who looked different from them, and no preparation was going to change that, and the system preferred not to acknowledge the injustice of this arrangement. This is part of the Victorian beauty rules that connects most directly to contemporary experience, because the legacy of these standards has not ended. The global beauty industry still sells more skin-lightening products than almost any other category. The association of lighter skin with attractiveness, professionalism, and social value that was constructed and reinforced in the Victorian era persists in modified forms around the world. Understanding it as historically constructed, as something that was built at a specific moment for specific purposes, and that can therefore be dismantled, is part of what historical analysis can do, even when the dismantling is slow and partial and contested. We are coming toward the end of our journey through this particular world, and I want to give the ending the care it deserves. Because we have spent a long time together in a world that required enormous amounts of invisible effort from its women, and I think it is worth sitting with what that effort was doing, not just for the women themselves but for the broader human project of making a life. The Victorian beauty rules were, at their core, a technology for managing the relationship between the private self and the public world. They were the equipment by which a woman presented herself as the right kind of person, signaled her position, maintained her social standing, communicated her membership in the communities that mattered to her survival and her well-being. They were exhausting and sometimes harmful, and built on assumptions that have not all aged well. They were also, in their way, a form of competence, a skill, a mastery of a complex system that required intelligence and practice and continuous attention. The women who were best at the Victorian beauty rules were not simply more obedient than others, they were more skilled. They understood a complex system and navigated it with intelligence and artfulness. They produced results, social safety, community belonging, the respect of their peers, that were real and that mattered to their actual lives. The fact that the system they were navigating was unjust does not diminish the intelligence and skill required to navigate it well, and they were, underneath all of it, people, with days when everything went right and days when nothing did, with private feelings about the corset and the powder and the managed smile that they could not always share, with moments of genuine pleasure in their own appearance, moments of satisfaction when the hair came right or the dress fitted as it should, moments of freedom in the evening when the pins came out and the day's construction was finally set aside. There is a Victorian expression, keeping up appearances, that has come down to us with a slightly negative connotation, suggesting something falsified, something maintained against the truth of what lies beneath. But the women who spent their lives doing exactly this were not, most of them, frauds or hypocrites or simply vain. They were managing the gap between who they were and what the world required them to be in the only way available to them. That gap, and the management of it, has not ended. The specific demands have changed, the specific preparations have changed, the specific rules have been revised. But the underlying structure, the expectation that women's appearance is a project, that the project requires effort, that the effort must not show, that the result will be judged, this has not gone away. And understanding it clearly, seeing it for what it is, and tracing it to its historical roots, is one of the small ways in which history can actually be useful, actually matter, actually change something in the way we move through the world. The woman at the Victorian dressing table was not more limited than us. She was differently limited, limited by different rules in a different system with different tools and different consequences, and she was, within those limits, as full a human being as any of us are within ours. The candle burns down, the fire is low, the hair is brushed out and the cream is on the face and the pins are in their dish, and somewhere across all the years she is settling into the pillows with the permission, finally, to simply be. Rest now. The morning and all its preparations are still hours away, and you, wherever you are tonight, in whatever corner of the world is holding you right now, you can rest too. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming back to Sleepy Old World. The next journey is already waiting. Sleep well.